Hi, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Dissidents and Dictators. My name is Elisha Maldonado, and I'm joined today by the funnest co-host ever, Casey Michelle. Say hi, Casey.
Well, hello.
We're coming to you again live from Oslo, Norway, where we're currently hosting and attending the annual Oslo Freedom Forum, which will explain some of the fun background noise you'll likely hear. You're welcome for it. We're joined by Carlos Chamorro, the renowned Nicaraguan journalist now living in exile after having his identity erased in his country's civil registry, being declared stateless by the regime of Daniel Ortega, branded a traitor, stripped of his political rights forever, and robbed of his assets. He's the founder and editor of Exile, which combines investigative journalism and current affairs analyses, and he's one of this year's Oslo Freedom Forum speakers. Carlos, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks to you for having me.
Can you tell us a little bit about your story? You were on stage yesterday, you had a really great speech. Can you give us a little bit of that? And then after that, we'd like to talk about journalism with you as three journalists sitting in here and in this booth. That's a clear booth in the forum, but a little bit about your story first would be lovely.
Well, I am a Nicaraguan reporter. Actually, I went into journalism in 1978 after my father's assassination. My father was a journalist. I myself never thought about being a journalist. Actually, I studied economics and I wanted to go for a master's or a PhD in economics or something like that. But after my father was killed by people related with the Somoza dictatorship, there was a popular explosion in Nicaragua and everything changed. And I took two decisions. One was to go into journalism. I thought journalism would be some kind of a tool for change. So I joined La Prensa, that was the newspaper that my father was directing. And at the same time, I got involved into politics. I got involved into the politics of, let's say, the insurrection against the Somoza dictatorship. Almost, 16 months later, there was a national insurrection and the dictatorship was overthrown, and that initiated the Nicaraguan revolution of the 80s. I was part of that process. That process at the beginning generated a lot of hopes for change, for democracy, mostly for social justice, but the process also radicalized and generated a lot of contradictions and crises, and there was also, the Cold War typical process under the Reagan administration that ended up in a terrible war in Nicaragua. It's a civil war and also a foreign intervention war. At that time, I was working, for the revolution. I became the editor of a newspaper named Barricada. I think at that time, everything was under the umbrella of the war, and we did not so much good journalism, but a lot of propaganda and counter-propaganda. In 1990, there was an election, and in this electoral process, my mother became the candidate of the opposition, and she won. She became the president. So I was still the director of that newspaper, Barricada, for a couple of years until I was expelled. I was expelled because I ended up transforming that newspaper that was strongly associated to the political party into a professional newspaper. So the party expelled me and some of the journalists, and from then on, I started on my own as an independent journalist, separating completely from politics. From party politics. Mm-hmm. And I founded Confidencial and Esta Semana, a TV program in 1995, 1996, just to investigate corruption, to promote public debate, to report the facts and the truth. And I did all that. I did that for more than 20 years. And then when Daniel Ortega came back to power in 2007, his policies at the beginning were very hostile against the independent press. I was the subject of harassment. They're lynching me in official television. They accused me of being related with drug trafficking for investigating corruption.
Trying to ruin your reputation as a
Yeah, but I survived all that process, and I think we strengthened the credibility of the independent press. So there was one point in this large process of confrontation with an authoritarian government in which finally the government sort of tolerated the independent press. But when we had a popular uprising, a civic insurrection in Nicaragua in April 2018, and this authoritarian government felt that his power was under threat, then they focused against the independent press as the enemy. And the enemy had to be destroyed. So we were the subject. Well, they massacred people, they tortured, they promoted massive illegal detentions, but they attacked the press brutally. Mm-hmm. When I say brutally, assassinations of journalists, attacks by paramilitary groups, television censorship, later repressive laws, and my own newsroom, Confidencial, was assaulted by the police in December 2018, and they stole all our equipment, but they could never. But we were always online. We didn't stop reporting a single day, a single moment, and that's the trajectory that we have been following since then.
And again, they are targeting you, not because you are committing any crimes, not because you're leading any kind of political movement, but because you are doing your job and exposing corruption, exposing criminal networks, and doing what journalism is all about. I mean, Carlos, you have this incredible family history. Your father was a journalist, also targeted for his work. You've been doing this for years and years. In the last few years, it must be the most difficult chapter of your journalism career. How do you keep going? How do you keep working on this topic, both personally but also professionally? How do you and your colleagues continue to operate as investigative journalists in a country, reporting on a country like Nicaragua under Daniel Ortega?
Well, since 2018, everything changed. And I was forced to go to my first exile in January 1st, 2019, after the assault of my newsroom, because I was under the threat of an imminent detention, illegal detention. There was not a legal order or anything like that. So I went through blind spots to the border through Costa Rica, and I started reporting from Costa Rica, but most of my team at that time was still in Nicaragua. There were just a few group of journalists that had to leave, and I came back at the end of the year 2019 because the government had released about 300 prisoners, and there was some kind of an attempt for the government not to normalize life because they imposed a police state, and the police state was never suspended, but there was some more, let's say, a little bit more of tolerance. But then the situation became worse in the year 2021. This was a period previous to the elections that were to take place in November that year. And on May 20, in the year 2021, my newsroom was assaulted for the second time by the police. They stole, once again, all our equipment. We continue working from home with no newsroom. I always said our newsroom is not a physical place. It's in the hearts and minds of our reporters, and we will continue covering. But then the situation became, there was an escalate of repression again when they captured the 7 aspiring presidential candidates of the opposition, but not only them, but some civic leaders, political leaders, businessmen, student leaders, and obviously journalists were also the target of this new escalate of repression. So I have to leave for a second time through blind spots to the border of Costa Rica. The difference this time is that there was a process of criminalization of journalism as a total process. not only freedom of the press, but also freedom of opinion and expression. So all our newsroom have to go to Exile. And I'm not only talking about Confidencial, I'm talking about La Prensa, 100% Noticias, all Nicaraguan independent media outlets. And there was about more than 200 journalists that have been forced to go to exile in Costa Rica, in the US, in Spain, in different countries. How do we work from exile? It's a very difficult process every day, mostly because our sources are criminalized. So we communicate with our sources through secure channels of communication, but it takes time to build a relationship of trust, and it takes a lot of time for us also to corroborate information from anonymous sources. Mm-hmm. So it's a double process that makes things more complex. We do a lot of, this work about processing information from social media, which is full of disinformation, but there are certain elements that are important for our job as reporters. And yes, we have been working like that for the last 3 years, and I think we have produced great stories about corruption within the government, within the army, about the massive exodus of Nicaraguans who are fleeing the country, about the persecution against the Catholic Church, about torture of political prisoners, and about the everyday life of Nicaraguans, which are stories of pain and hope. And that's what we do every day.
And at the end of the day, you are continuing to do your job as a journalist. Doesn't matter where you are, doesn't matter where your colleagues are, you're still producing, you're still investigating, you're still reporting, which I'm sure Ortega is not very happy with. I'm sure he thought if we just get them out of the country, they will stop, but you have continued.
Yes, and again, it's not just my case as an individual. I'm talking, I would say, for all the Nicaraguan independent media in exile. And I think we have become an important source of information for our audiences in Nicaragua and also abroad. And as I said, journalism in exile is the last reserve of freedom in a country where there is no freedom at all. I mean, the government eliminated 4,000 associations and NGOs related with, from the Red Cross to the Mother Teresa of Calcutta nuns, to the business chambers, to private universities, or associations related with education, with health, with anything. They basically eliminated civil society.
So the only information in the country is state-controlled media or television at all? Or do they,
There is something that you could call official media, which is not state media, but it's private media owned by the Ortega family and it's run by Ortega's siblings. And there are also some, let's say, non-state controlled media, but they are completely co-opted. They cannot report the news. They talk about traffic accidents, the weather, or official information and this kind of thing. But if they cross the line, and that is the case of Victor Ticay. Victor Ticay was a reporter of one of these, let's say, Nicaraguan television channels, and he covered a religious procession. And when he broadcasted these images in his Facebook account, he was put in prison the day after by the police. Why is that a crime to report about a religious procession? Well, that's Nicaragua.
So the punishments are that swift if they dislike a story that you've been reporting on, just on a dime you're arrested?
The very next day.
Yes, and he was disappeared. When I say he was disappeared, I'm talking literally. For 40 days, nobody knew where was he, until one night the government said that he had been submitted to a trial, and in this trial he had been found guilty of conspiracy and spreading fake news, and now he's condemned for 8 years in prison.
I was going to ask if there were, because reporting is already a difficult task, I think, in general, to make sure you're reporting out the truth, right? And vetting the proper sources so that you're telling the truth. But so I was going to ask, under a regime if there are bureaucratic ways they slow roll or make that job harder. But it sounds like you don't really have to do that much to be disappeared. They're not even slow rolling that process. Is that what?
I'm sorry, I don't.
Usually these regimes, they find certain laws, certain legislations where they say, okay, you broke this law, you will go to trial, and eventually you will go to jail. But this example was the very next day.
The state of the law collapsed many years ago in Nicaragua. There's no fair trial about anything. I mean, I was declared a traitor to the homeland. I was erased from the civil registry, me and my wife, and we are about 317 people in that condition. In this group, where we are about 15 to 20 journalists.
Carlos, has anything surprised you about the regime's response to your work, to your colleagues' work? Has it surprised you that they have reacted so strongly, or are there specific decisions they have taken that have surprised you in any way?
Well, yes, they have surprised me about the brutality, about the reactions that they have taken. Like last year, we did a story about the army, about the chief of the army, and about the 20 generals who are part of, let's say, at the top of the army, and they're imposing. They're not allowing the military career to go up. There are many other officers who will never get to the top because these guys have been there for 10 or to 15 years. So we did this story, we documented the story, we told our audiences who is who within the army. And 2 days later, they had the Army National Day. So the chief of the army gave a speech in front of all the military units. And out of the sudden, he started talking about mercenary journalism. He didn't mention us with our names, but everybody knew that he was reacting to that story. And he said that these mercenary journalists were putting pressure to the army so that they will give a coup d'etat, but they will never do that because they are loyal to the president. So he ended up attacking us and threatening us, and we're journalists in exile, but yes, we had to take care about their threats. I said, well, they obliged me to respond. And I said, well, the chief of the army has not contradicted a single line, a single image of what we just reported. And now this is a national topic. Everybody should be debating about why there are 20 generals within the army who have been, let's say, corrupting the army, and they have been accomplices of a coup d'etat from above that have taken place in Nicaragua. That's one example. I could give you another example. It's about the story of Miss Universe. Have you heard about that? Cheney's Palacios?
I don't remember this story.
Well, that's a great story.
Please tell us.
You should talk about it. You should know about that. This is not something. Well, we all reported that story. This is a Nicaraguan young woman, beautiful, talented, who won the national contest, beauty contest, so she became Miss Nicaragua, and she went to compete for Miss Universe. And she won Miss Universe for the first time in history of a woman from Nicaragua and Central America. So that night, Nicaraguan people exploded with happiness. They forgot for one moment that we live under a police state, and they did something that was prohibited. They went out to the streets. They had caravans, they have marched, they celebrated. They came out with the national flag. The national flag is a crime in Nicaragua. It has been banned by the government. And they did all that in that night of celebration. So the day after, people were speculating about what Cheney was going to do if she was going to come to Nicaragua. She didn't come to Nicaragua. She went to Miami, to Mexico, to follow the Miss Universe process. But a few days later, the Miss Nicaragua group that were the owner of the franchise of Miss Universe, they were criminalized, and they were captured. detained, disappeared for 40 days, and the woman, the Karen Celebrity, the owner of Miss Nicaragua, she tried to return back to the country, and she was expelled. She was expelled to Mexico. She was not allowed to go into the country. A few days later, finally, the police come out with a report, and they say that the Miss Universe and Miss Nicaragua organization is a criminal one. They're doing money laundering, and they have been in a conspiracy against the government to support a rebellion and a coup d'etat. And now, just to finish the story, Chinese Palacios, the Miss Nicaragua, who represents happiness for Nicaraguans and unity, she cannot come back to the country. She's an exile like myself.
We talk about a lot of dictatorships on this podcast.
Yeah.
And we talk about a lot of dictators targeting journalists. I don't think I've ever heard of another dictatorship targeting Miss Universe before, or any other beauty
Going
pageant.
after
What they are targeting is people's power, to reunion, to mobilization, to empowerment. That's what they're targeting. The same reason why they target bishops and Catholic priests. And they have prohibited processions because they don't want people to get together. It's just like the memory of the big, large demonstration that took place in 2018. So that is the essence of a police state, preventive repression. They don't allow people to reunite. They don't allow people to talk, to march. And there is a system of vigilance and spying and repression.
Ortega himself knows what these popular uprisings can lead to and the changes they can lead to.
And that tells you a lot about the lack of popular support that they have and about the fragility of this kind of totalitarian dictatorship. So we're not going to be responsible for changing that government. It's not enough to report the news from Exile, but it is important to keep doing that because it's like, keeping the last flame of information that is important for society.
I was just going to say, back a point, talking about the celebrations in the streets, one of the things that we always say at HRF is that having fun is a revolutionary act, that dictators don't like it. And that is a perfect example of that, celebrating something that is, your country winning something. Well, let's squelch that too. Let's punish people for that. I just think it's a perfect example of how dictators don't even like people to have fun, bands to unite together in the streets, and that, even in that way.
Carlos, in recent years, we have seen the growth of international journalist organizations, especially investigative journalist organizations. Since your exile, have you been involved with any international journalistic networks? I also wonder if you have learned any lessons or maybe collaborated on stories with other exiled journalists from places like Venezuela, from places like Cuba, or elsewhere. Has that been part of your work?
Absolutely. There's one, it's one of the, let's say, of our challenges, lines of work, collaborative journalism with colleagues from Central America, from Venezuela, from Cuba. We promoted a forum, a virtual forum with media outlets from these countries that I'm mentioning. Well, we're also part of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalism, and we're also part and work together with the Center for CLIP, something which is called CLIP, which is Centro de Investigación de Periodismo Latinoamericano, and we have produced different stories about migration, where we work together with the Panama Papers and others. But it is an imperative to work together with journalists from other countries to produce transnational stories, and we continue doing that.
I can't believe the Panama Papers is almost 10 years old at this point, and that again was maybe the first big data revelation of
That's
all
correct.
of these offshore networks. I can't remember off the top of my head, was Ortega or his family, were they mentioned in the Panama Papers? Any high-ranking Nicaraguan officials?
Not really. There were other people, but not Ortega himself.
Well, we're still waiting for more information on his personal
Absolutely, we need it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And also congratulations on your Golden Pen Award.
Oh, thank you.
The high honor.
That's that award. I said that It's very important in this moment in which journalism is criminalized, not only in Nicaragua, but also in other countries. And I share it with my colleague, Jose Rubén Zamora, Chepe Zamora from Guatemala, who is in prison, or Gustavo Gorriti from Peru, who's under persecution, or Armando Info from Venezuela, and obviously my colleagues from the independent press of Nicaragua in exile.
Well, keep up the good work. Thank you so much for being on.
Thank you, Carlos.
The Human Rights Foundation is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that promotes and protects human rights globally, with a focus on closed societies. We promote freedom where it's most at risk, in countries ruled by authoritarian regimes.